Marcus Chen had always been average. Average height, average grades, average everything. Growing up on Kepler 442b, a tiny agricultural colony on the edge of known space, average was all anyone expected from him. The colony had 3,000 people, 2 grocery stores, and one dream shared by every young person: getting accepted into the Galactic Defense Academy. When his acceptance letter arrived, Marcus stared at it for 10 minutes. His parents cried. His little sister jumped around the kitchen. The whole colony threw him a farewell party at the community center, complete with his grandmother's famous apple pie made from Earth heritage seeds. Now, 6 months later, Marcus stood in the massive hangar bay of GDA Station Omega, watching cadets from dozens of species prepare for their first joint training exercise. The Zephyrians towered 8 feet tall with their crystalline skin catching the light. The aquatic Nereidans moved in their mobility suits, tentacles gracefully manipulating multiple tools at once. The insectoid Vrakti clicked and chittered in their rapid-fire language. And then there were the humans, scattered throughout the hangar like afterthoughts. Chen, Instructor Vex High, barked, his reptilian features twisted in what might have been annoyance. "You're with Squad 7. Try not to embarrass your species." Marcus jogged over to his assigned group, nodding at his squad mates. There was Kayla, a Zephyrian whose parents were both decorated war heroes. Blip, a Nereidan whose family controlled 3 ocean worlds. Zakth, a Vrakti whose hive had produced 12 admirals. And Marcus, whose dad grew soybeans. "First exercise is simple," Instructor Vexhai announced to the assembled cadets. "Capture the flag in the Talon Nebula simulation. Each squad gets a ship. Each ship has equal capabilities. Work together, use your species' natural advantages, and don't die. Questions?" Nobody raised their hand. In the academy, asking questions was seen as weakness. Marcus climbed aboard their assigned vessel, a sleek destroyer-class ship with enough firepower to level a small moon. Kayla immediately took the pilot's seat, her crystalline fingers dancing over the controls with practiced ease. Blip settled at the sensor station, 4 tentacles working different interfaces simultaneously. Zakth skittered to the weapons console, compound eyes tracking multiple targets. That left Marcus at the communications station, the leftover position, the one that didn't require any special abilities or generations of military breeding. Their ship launched into the simulated nebula, a swirling mass of purple and gold gases that played havoc with sensors. Somewhere in this maze were 11 other squads, all hunting for the same target, a small beacon representing the enemy flag. "Contact bearing 27 Mark IV, Blip announced, tentacles flowing over his controls. "It's Squad 3, the Calaxian team." Marcus had heard about the Calaxians. 7 feet of muscle and bone evolved from pack hunters. They'd never lost a simulation exercise. "Taking evasive action," Kayla said, banking hard to starboard. The ship groaned under the stress, artificial gravity struggling to compensate. Through the view screen, Marcus watched the Calaxian ship emerge from the nebula like a predator from tall grass. It was painted in their traditional black and red war colors, and it moved with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of experienced hands at the controls. "They're locking weapons," Zakth chittered nervously. "Return fire," Kala ordered. The space battle that followed was textbook perfect. Both ships danced through the nebula, exchanging plasma bursts and missile volleys. The Calaxians were good, but Kayla was better. She used the nebula's interference to mask their approach, while Blip fed her targeting data that let Zakth place their shots with surgical precision. But something felt wrong to Marcus. He'd been monitoring communications across all frequencies, a habit he'd picked up growing up on a world where the nearest help was 3 weeks away by FTL. His grandmother always said, "Listen before you speak, watch before you move." "Squad 7, this is Squad 2, came a transmission on a narrow beam frequency. "We've got the flag. Calaxian ship is just a distraction. They're trying to draw everyone away from the real target." Marcus's blood went cold. He checked the tactical display. Squad 2 was a mixed group with 2 humans, 1 Zephyrian and a Vrakti. If they had the flag, every other squad would converge on their position within minutes. "Kayla," Marcus said quietly, "we need to break off. Are you insane?" She snapped, not taking her eyes off the battle. "We're winning. Squad 2 has the flag. This is a distraction." The Calaxian ship chose that moment to explode in a brilliant flash of light. Kala whooped in triumph, but Marcus was already pulling up the communication logs on his console. "Look at this," he said, transferring the data to the main screen. "The Calaxians have been broadcasting false positioning data for the last 8 minutes. They've been making us think they were in combat when they were actually moving toward the flag zone." Zakath's compound eyes focused on the data. The human is correct. The transmission timestamps don't match the battle choreography. Blip's tentacles stilled over his controls. "How did you notice this?" Marcus shrugged, embarrassed. "I just listened to everything. My mom always said you never know what might be important." Kayla stared at him for a long moment. "Your mother is very wise. Blip, can you track Squad 2's real position?" "Already on it," the Narradan replied. "They're heading for the extraction point. We have maybe 4 minutes before they win. Then we'd better hurry." Their ship shot through the nebula at maximum burn, Kayla pushing the engines past their safety limits. Behind them, Marcus watched on sensors as the other squads finally realized they'd been chasing shadows. Squad 4, Squad 9, Squad 11, all converging on the same point. "This is going to be interesting," Marcus muttered, then keyed his microphone to broadcast on all frequencies. "All squads, this is Squad 7. Squad 2 has the flag and is heading for Extraction Point Alpha. Suggest immediate pursuit." The response was immediate chaos. 11 ships suddenly changed course, abandoning their search patterns to race toward the extraction point. Squad 2, realizing their deception had been uncovered, began broadcasting desperate pleas for assistance. "Why did you do that?" Kala asked. Marcus checked his instruments. "Because now everyone's going to be fighting each other instead of us. We can slip in during the confusion." And that's exactly what happened. By the time Squad 7 reached the extraction point, 10 ships were engaged in a massive furball of a battle. Plasma bolts filled space like a deadly light show. Squad 2's ship limped through the chaos, hull breached in 3 places, trying desperately to reach the finish line. "Take us in quiet," Marcus suggested. "Minimum power, drift trajectory." Kayla killed their engines and let momentum carry them forward. On sensors, they were just another piece of debris in an increasingly crowded battlefield. Squad 2 never saw them coming. The capture was almost anticlimactic. One precisely placed shot disabled Squad 2's engines. A quick boarding action secured the flag. By the time the other squads realized what had happened, Squad 7 was already at the extraction point. "Exercise complete," came Instructor Vexhigh's voice over the communication system. "Squad 7 wins. All ships return to dock." In the hangar bay afterward, Marcus found himself surrounded by cadets from other species. They peppered him with questions about his tactical analysis, his communication monitoring, his ability to read between the lines of what wasn't being said. "How did you know to look for false transmission timestamps?" asked a Calaxian whose respect was evident in the way she kept her claws sheathed. "Where I come from," Marcus said. "We have to fix our own communication arrays when they break. You learn to spot when signals don't match up with reality." A Zephyrian nodded slowly. "Your colony taught you well." Marcus smiled, thinking of home. Maybe being from a small world where everyone had to know a little bit of everything wasn't such a disadvantage after all. In a galaxy full of specialists, sometimes what you needed was someone who knew how to notice the things others missed. As he walked back to his quarters, Marcus caught fragments of conversation from the other cadets. For the first time since arriving at the academy, they weren't talking about his average scores or his unremarkable background. They were talking about the human who saw through the perfect deception. 3 weeks later, Marcus learned that success at the academy came with unexpected complications. Word of Squad 7's victory had spread through the cadet corps like wildfire, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about the human from Kepler 442b. The attention made him uncomfortable. During breakfast in the massive dining hall, conversations would stop when he passed by. Cadets from species he'd never even seen before would nod respectfully. A few brave souls even asked if they could sit with him, but it was the instructor's reactions that really puzzled him. "Chen," barked Instructor Theknar, a massive Gornish warrior whose species had conquered half their star cluster before joining the Galactic Federation. Front and center, Marcus stood at attention in the tactical simulation room, surrounded by floating holographic displays showing fleet movements across a dozen star systems. This was advanced strategic planning, supposedly the hardest course in the Academy's curriculum. "You see this scenario? Teknar gestured at the largest display with one of his forearms. The hegemony has invaded the Kepler sector. They have numerical superiority, better ships, and they've already taken 3 worlds. Standard Federation doctrine calls for a fighting retreat, while we marshal reinforcements. What do you see? Marcus studied the display carefully. The hegemony forces were advancing in a classic pincer movement, designed to trap the Federation fleet between 2 crushing arms. It was elegant, efficient, and almost certainly unstoppable. Permission to speak freely, sir? Granted. The hegemony's formation assumes we'll fight like they do. They expect us to mass our forces and meet them head-on. Correct. Your point? Marcus highlighted several positions on the tactical map, but look at their supply lines. They're extended across 17 light-years, and they're using predictable jump routes. They have to. Their ships are too big for the alternative hyperspace lanes. A murmur went through the room. Marcus glanced around and realized that every cadet in the class was staring at him. Even the normally unflappable Zephyrians looked surprised. Go on, Teknar rumbled. On my colony, we had problems with crop pirates. Small groups that would hit our agricultural transports and disappear into the asteroid fields. We couldn't fight them directly. They were too fast, too mobile. So we learned to think like farmers instead of soldiers. Explain. Marcus manipulated the holographic display, highlighting the hegemony's vulnerable points. You don't fight the weeds in your field. You poison the soil they grow in. The hegemony's strength comes from their industrial worlds feeding their war machine. Cut those supply lines and their massive fleets become massive liabilities. He showed how small. Fast Federation ships could use the alternative hyperspace routes that the hegemony's dreadnoughts couldn't access. Hit-and-run attacks on supply convoys, surgical strikes on fuel depots and ammunition factories. Make the enemy's size work against them. The big ships can't follow us into the tight hyperspace lanes, Marcus continued, and they can't protect their entire supply network simultaneously. Force them to spread out trying to defend everything, then hit them where they're weakest. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Teknar stared at the modified tactical display for a long moment, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence. This is guerrilla warfare, the instructor said finally. Yes, sir. The Federation doesn't fight guerrilla wars. We have superior technology, better training, higher moral standards. We meet our enemies honorably in open battle. Marcus nodded. Yes, sir. But sometimes the honorable fight is the one you lose. The silence stretched even longer. Then Teknar did something Marcus had never seen him do before. He smiled, revealing rows of predatory teeth. Cadet Chen, report to Admiral Reyes's office at 1400 hours. Sir, did I do something wrong? On the contrary, I think you may have done something very right. Admiral Elena Reyes was the only human flag officer at GDA Station Omega, and Marcus had never expected to meet her. Her office was spartanly decorated, with just a few mementos from her 30-year career. A piece of hull metal from the Battle of Proxima, a ceremonial blade from the Altarian Peace Accords, and a small hologram of Earth. Sit down. Cadet, she said without looking up from her desk. I've been reviewing your file. Marcus sat ramrod straight in the uncomfortable chair. Yes, ma'am. Born on Kepler 442b. Population 3,000 and change. Agricultural colony established by the Terran Colonial Authority in 2387. Your parents are farmers. Your sister wants to be a veterinarian. You graduated valedictorian of your high school class, which consisted of 12 people. Yes, ma'am. Admiral Reyes finally looked up. She was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe 50, with graying hair and the kind of steady eyes that came from making life or death decisions. Tell me about the crop pirates. Ma'am, Instructor Teknar mentioned that your colony had problems with raiders. I want details. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't really a military situation, ma'am. Just some desperate people trying to steal food shipments. Humor me, so Marcus told her. About the raiders who would hit the supply convoys running between Kepler 442b and the processing stations in the asteroid belt. How they used salvaged ships and improvised weapons, striking fast and disappearing before the colony's single patrol ship could respond. The Colonial Authority wanted to send a security fleet, Marcus continued, but that would have taken 6 months, and we needed those food shipments to trade for medical supplies and equipment. So the Colony Council decided to handle it ourselves. How? My dad came up with the idea. He said we were thinking like farmers trying to fight soldiers, when we should have been thinking like farmers trying to outsmart pests. Admiral Reyes leaned forward. Go on. We started using decoy convoys, fake cargo ships filled with tracking devices and automated distress beacons. When the raiders hit the decoys, we'd follow them back to their base. Then we'd wait until they launched their next raid and hit their supply caches while they were gone. You starved them out. We made raiding unprofitable. After they lost 3 supply bases and all their stored food, they decided to try honest work instead. Most of them ended up settling on Kepler 442b. Good people, just desperate. Admiral Reyes was quiet for a long moment. Outside her window, Marcus could see the steady traffic of ships arriving and departing from the station. Freighters, patrol vessels, the occasional warship heading out to trouble spots along the frontier. Cadet Chen, what do you know about the hegemony? Only what they teach us in xenological studies, ma'am. Militaristic society, strong belief in might makes right. Expanding aggressively into Federation space. What they don't teach you is that we're losing. The Admiral's voice was matter-of-fact, but Marcus felt the words like a physical blow. Not quickly and not obviously, but we're losing. Every engagement, we trade ships we can't replace for ships they build faster than we can destroy them. Marcus swallowed hard. Why are you telling me this, ma'am? Because you're the first cadet I've met who thinks like a farmer instead of a soldier. And right now that might be exactly what we need. She stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind her back. The hegemony respects strength. They understand overwhelming force and decisive victory. What they don't understand is patience, persistence, the willingness to lose 100 small battles in order to win the war. You want me to help plan irregular warfare operations. I want you to think about how a small agricultural colony might fight the hegemony empire. Not today, not next week, but starting right now with your education. Admiral Reyes turned back to face him. I'm recommending you for accelerated strategic studies, advanced xenopsychology, extended practical training with irregular warfare specialists. It won't be easy, and it certainly won't be traditional. Marcus thought about his quiet life on Kepler 442b, the long days in the fields, the community gatherings, the simple satisfaction of work well done. Then he thought about hegemony warships burning Federation colonies. Ma'am, when do I start? For the first time since he'd entered her office, Admiral Reyes smiled. Welcome to the real war, Cadet Chen. As Marcus left the Admiral's office, he passed a group of senior cadets in the corridor. They stepped aside to let him pass, but he caught fragments of their whispered conversation. That's the human from the simulation exercise. I heard he's being fast-tracked to strategic planning. My instructor says Admiral Reyes personally requested his file. Marcus kept walking, trying to process what had just happened. A few months ago, he'd been nobody special from nowhere important. Now he was apparently being groomed for irregular warfare, operations against humanity's greatest enemy. His grandmother had always said that opportunity and responsibility were just different words for the same thing. As he headed back to his quarters to study for tomorrow's examinations, Marcus was beginning to understand what she meant. Briefing room 7 Alpha was smaller than Marcus expected, with just 6 chairs around a circular table. When he arrived at 800 sharp, 5 of those chairs were already occupied by people who looked like they'd stepped out of his worst nightmares about military black operations. There was Colonel Yates, a cybernetically enhanced former Marine whose left eye glowed with augmented reality displays. Dr. Vasquez, a neuroscientist whose research into battlefield psychology had been classified after her first paper. Captain Song, a logistics specialist who'd somehow managed to keep 3 colonies supplied during simultaneous hegemony sieges. Lieutenant Torres, a communications expert whose work on quantum entanglement networks was so far ahead of current technology that most people thought it was science fiction. And at the head of the table, General Patricia Morrison, whose presence made Marcus want to stand at attention even though she was sitting down. Cadet Chen, General Morrison said without preamble. Admiral Reyes tells me you've been thinking about unconventional warfare applications. Yes, ma'am. Show me. Marcus activated the room's holographic display and pulled up the presentation he'd spent all night preparing. It started with a map of Federation space, showing the current front lines and projected hegemony advance patterns. The hegemony's expansion follows predictable patterns, he began. They target resource-rich systems first, then consolidate their gains before moving on to the next sector. Standard Federation response is to contest each invasion with fleet actions. Which we're losing, Colonel Yates interjected. Yes, sir. But we're fighting their kind of war instead of our kind of war. Marcus highlighted a dozen systems along the frontier. These colonies will probably fall within the next 2 years. Standard doctrine says we should defend them to the last ship. I propose we do something different. Surrender? Dr. Vasquez asked, her tone neutral. Prepare. Turn each colony into a long-term asset instead of a short-term loss. The holographic display zoomed in on one particular system. New Hebrides, a mining colony with 2 million inhabitants and significant industrial infrastructure. New Hebrides will fall, Marcus continued. The math is clear. We can't get enough ships there in time, and their defensive platforms won't stop a hegemony battle group. But what if we prepared the colony for a different kind of resistance? He showed how communication networks could be hardened and hidden before the invasion, how civilian infrastructure could be modified to support underground operations, how the colony's own industrial capacity could be turned into weapons production for guerrilla forces. You're talking about sacrificing 2 million people, Captain Song said flatly. I'm talking about turning 2 million people into a permanent thorn in the hegemony side. They'll spend more resources occupying New Hebrides than they'll ever extract from it. General Morrison leaned forward. Explain the seed pod concept. Marcus had spent hours thinking about how to phrase this. On my home colony, we plant cover crops. Plants that don't produce food directly but improve the soil for future harvests. They protect against erosion, fix nitrogen, break up hardpan soil layers. And in military terms, we seed colonies that are going to fall with everything they need to become long-term resistance centers. Not just weapons and supplies, but people with the right training, communication networks that can survive occupation, infrastructure modifications that won't be obvious to the hegemony until it's too late to stop them. Lieutenant Torres spoke up. The quantum entanglement communicators I've been developing could work for this. Undetectable, unhackable, instantaneous across any distance. How many colonies could we prepare before the hegemony advance reaches them? Dr. Vasquez asked. Marcus had done the calculations. 17 systems in the first wave, maybe 30 more in the second wave. After that, word will get out and the hegemony will adapt their occupation procedures. 47 colonies, General Morrison said thoughtfully. 47 permanent resistance centers deep in hegemony space. It gets better, Marcus continued. Each resistance cell can support operations in adjacent systems. Spread intelligence gathering, coordinate supply lines, share tactical information, turn the hegemony's own communication networks against them. Colonel Yates was studying the tactical projections. This is a 20-year plan. Maybe 30? Yes, sir. But it's a plan for winning instead of just losing slowly. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air recycling system. Marcus waited, trying not to fidget under the scrutiny of some of the most dangerous people in Federation space. Finally, General Morrison spoke. Cadet Chen, what you're proposing violates about 15 different articles of the Federation Military Code. We don't abandon civilians to enemy occupation. We don't turn colony worlds into resistance bases without their consent. We don't plan strategic retreats that involve sacrificing entire star systems. Marcus's heart sank. Yes, ma'am. Which is why, the general continued, this conversation never happened. What you're looking at is Project Seed Pod, and as of right now, you're the newest member of a very small, very unofficial group of people who are going to make sure humanity survives the next century. It took a moment for the words to sink in. Ma'am? You're being transferred to Special Operations Command effective immediately. Your official academy records will show that you washed out due to academic difficulties. Your family will receive a letter expressing sympathy for your failure to complete the program. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. My family? Dr. Vasquez looked sympathetic. For security reasons, they can't know what you're really doing. The cover story is that you're working as a civilian contractor for a mining company in the outer colonies. Boring but believable. How long? Until the war is over, General Morrison said. One way or the other. The next few hours were a blur of security briefings, classified documentation, and medical examinations. By the time Marcus finally had a moment to think, he was sitting in a Spartan quarters 3 levels below the Academy's main complex, holding a priority message tablet addressed to his parents. The message was pre-written, clinical in its brevity. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Chen, we regret to inform you that your son Marcus has been dismissed from the Galactic Defense Academy due to failure to meet academic standards. He has accepted employment with Titan Mining Consortium and will be stationed in the outer colonies for the foreseeable future. While we understand your disappointment, Marcus set the tablet aside without finishing. Outside his new quarters, he could hear the distant sounds of the academy going about its normal business. Cadets hurrying to classes, instructors barking orders, the steady rhythm of military life. He thought about his sister Emma, who was probably showing his acceptance letter to her friends at Briefing Room 7 Alpha was smaller than Marcus expected, with just 6 chairs around a circular table. When he arrived at 800 sharp, 5 of those chairs were already occupied by people who looked like they'd stepped out of his worst nightmares about military black operations. There was Colonel Yates, a cybernetically enhanced former Marine whose left eye glowed with augmented reality displays. Dr. Vasquez, a neuroscientist whose research into battlefield psychology had been classified after her first paper. Captain Song, a logistics specialist who'd somehow managed to keep 3 colonies supplied during simultaneous hegemony sieges. Lieutenant Torres, a communications expert whose work on quantum entanglement networks was so far ahead of current technology that most people thought it was science fiction. And at the head of the table, General Patricia Morrison, whose presence made Marcus want to stand at attention even though she was sitting down. Cadet Chen, General Morrison said without preamble. Admiral Reyes tells me you've been thinking about unconventional warfare applications. Yes, ma'am. Show me. Marcus activated the room's holographic display and pulled up the presentation he'd spent all night preparing. It started with a map of Federation space, showing the current front lines and projected hegemony advance patterns. The hegemony's expansion follows predictable patterns, he began. They target resource-rich systems first, then consolidate their gains before moving on to the next sector. Standard Federation response is to contest each invasion with fleet actions. Which we're losing, Colonel Yates interjected. Yes, sir, but we're fighting their kind of war instead of our kind of war. Marcus highlighted a dozen systems along the frontier. These colonies will probably fall within the next 2 years. Standard doctrine says we should defend them to the last ship. I propose we do something different. Surrender? Dr. Vasquez asked, her tone neutral. Prepare. Turn each colony into a long-term asset instead of a short-term loss. The holographic display zoomed in on one particular system. New Hebrides, a mining colony with 2 million inhabitants and significant industrial infrastructure. New Hebrides will fall, Marcus continued. The math is clear. We can't get enough ships there in time, and their defensive platforms won't stop a hegemony battle group. But what if we prepared the colony for a different kind of resistance? He showed how communication networks could be hardened and hidden before the invasion, how civilian infrastructure could be modified to support underground operations, how the colony's own industrial capacity could be turned into weapons production for guerrilla forces. You're talking about sacrificing 2 million people, Captain Song said flatly. I'm talking about turning 2 million people into a permanent thorn in the hegemony side. They'll spend more resources occupying New Hebrides than they'll ever extract from it. General Morrison leaned forward. Explain the seed pod concept. Marcus had spent hours thinking about how to phrase this. On my home colony, we plant cover crops. Plants that don't produce food directly but improve the soil for future harvests. They protect against erosion, fix nitrogen, break up hardpan soil layers. And in military terms, we seed colonies that are going to fall with everything they need to become long-term resistance centers. Not just weapons and supplies, but people with the right training, communication networks that can survive occupation, infrastructure modifications that won't be obvious to the hegemony until it's too late to stop them. Lieutenant Torres spoke up. The quantum entanglement communicators I've been developing could work for this. Undetectable, unhackable, instantaneous across any distance. How many colonies could we prepare before the hegemony advance reaches them? Dr. Vasquez asked. Marcus had done the calculations. 17 systems in the first wave, maybe 30 more in the second wave. After that, word will get out and the hegemony will adapt their occupation procedures. 47 colonies, General Morrison said thoughtfully. 47 permanent resistance centers deep in hegemony space. It gets better, Marcus continued. Each resistance cell can support operations in adjacent systems. Spread intelligence gathering, coordinate supply lines, share tactical information. turn the hegemony's own communication networks against them. Colonel Yates was studying the tactical projections. This is a 20-year plan. Maybe 30? Yes, sir. But it's a plan for winning instead of just losing slowly. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air recycling system. Marcus waited, trying not to fidget under the scrutiny of some of the most dangerous people in Federation space. Finally, General Morrison spoke. Cadet Chen, what you're proposing violates about 15 different articles of the Federation Military Code. We don't abandon civilians to enemy occupation. We don't turn colony worlds into resistance bases without their consent. We don't plan strategic retreats that involve sacrificing entire star systems. Marcus's heart sank. Yes, ma'am. Which is why, the general continued, this conversation never happened. What you're looking at is Project Seed Pod, and as of right now, you're the newest member of a very small, very unofficial group of people who are going to make sure humanity survives the next century. It took a moment for the words to sink in. Ma'am? You're being transferred to Special Operations Command effective immediately. Your official academy records will show that you washed out due to academic difficulties. Your family will receive a letter expressing sympathy for your failure to complete the program. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. My family? Dr. Vasquez looked sympathetic. For security reasons, they can't know what you're really doing. The cover story is that you're working as a civilian contractor for a mining company in the outer colonies. Boring but believable. How long? Until the war is over, General Morrison said. One way or the other. The next few hours were a blur of security briefings, classified documentation, and medical examinations. By the time Marcus finally had a moment to think, he was sitting in a Spartan quarters 3 levels below the Academy's main complex, holding a priority message tablet addressed to his parents. The message was pre-written, clinical in its brevity. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Chen, we regret to inform you that your son Marcus has been dismissed from the Galactic Defense Academy due to failure to meet academic standards. He has accepted employment with Titan Mining Consortium and will be stationed in the outer colonies for the foreseeable future. While we understand your disappointment, Marcus set the tablet aside without finishing. Outside his new quarters, he could hear the distant sounds of the academy going about its normal business. Cadets hurrying to classes, instructors barking orders, the steady rhythm of military life. He thought about his sister Emma, who was probably showing his acceptance letter to her friends at Kepler 6119c was everything Marcus had expected from a frontier mining colony. Rough, practical, and suspicious of outsiders. The planet's surface was scarred by massive extraction operations that pulled rare Earth elements from deep underground, feeding the Federation's industrial machine. 40,000 people lived in prefabricated cities that looked like they could be disassembled and moved at a moment's notice, which, Marcus realized, was exactly what made it perfect for Project Seed Pod. You're the new efficiency consultant? Asked Maria Santos, the colony's administrator, when Marcus reported to the main government complex. She was a weathered woman in her 50s with the kind of skeptical expression that came from dealing with too many corporate representatives who promised to make things better and usually made them worse. Something like that, Marcus replied, handing over his forged credentials. According to his cover identity, he worked for Titan Mining Consortium as a systems analyst specializing in communication network optimization. Well, Mr. Chen, I hope you're better than the last consultant they sent us. That one tried to convince us we needed to centralize all our communication systems for improved efficiency. Took us 3 weeks to explain why that was the stupidest idea anyone had ever proposed for a mining operation. Marcus smiled. I'm more interested in redundancy than efficiency. Multiple backup systems, distributed control networks, the kind of infrastructure that keeps working even when the primary systems fail. Now that, Santos said, sounds like someone who understands mining operations. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into learning everything about Kepler 619c. He studied the colony's communication networks, power distribution systems, and transportation infrastructure. He attended town meetings, spent time in the mining tunnels, and shared drinks with off-duty workers in the colony's single bar. What he found was a community that was already remarkably well prepared for independence, though they didn't realize it. The miners were used to working in dangerous conditions with unreliable equipment. The colony's engineers had decades of experience jury-rigging solutions when standard equipment failed. The entire population had the kind of practical skills and self-reliant attitude that would be invaluable in a resistance situation. But they also had something else. Hope. "This place won't be a frontier forever," explained Tom Reacher, the colony's chief engineer, as he showed Marcus through the main power plant. "In 10 years, maybe 15, we'll have enough infrastructure to support real cities. Maybe even terraform parts of the surface." Marcus nodded and made notes on his tablet, but privately he wondered if Kepler 619c had 10 months, let alone 10 years. The hegemony's advance was accelerating, and intelligence reports suggested they were particularly interested in resource-rich systems like this one. His real work began after hours, in meetings that never appeared on any official schedule. The other seed pod operatives had been filtering into the colony over the past month, taking jobs as miners, technicians, and support staff. They met in maintenance tunnels, empty storage facilities, and the vast underground chambers where the mining equipment was stored. Dr. Elizabeth Kim was the operations medical specialist, officially employed as a physician's assistant at the colony's small hospital. In reality, she was teaching selected colonists advanced battlefield medicine and survival techniques disguised as workplace safety training. "The key," she explained to Marcus during one of their briefings, "is making the training seem routine. The hegemony won't suspect a colony that has better medical protocols and emergency response procedures. They'll just think we're thorough." James Patterson was handling weapons and explosives, working as a demolition specialist for the mining operation. He was showing trusted miners how to repurpose industrial equipment into defensive systems, always with plausible civilian explanations. "Mining charges are mining charges," he told Marcus with a grin. "Doesn't matter if you're blasting through rock or through a hegemony checkpoint. The chemistry is the same." But it was Sarah Okafor who impressed Marcus the most. She was Kara's older sister, and she'd volunteered for seed pod operations. After learning about her sister's escape from New Lagos, her job was cultural preservation, identifying and protecting the elements of colonial society that would be most important to maintain during occupation. "The hegemony doesn't just want to control bodies and resources," she explained during one of their late-night planning sessions. "They want to control minds, make people forget who they used to be. How do we fight that? Same way humans have always preserved culture under oppression. Stories, songs, traditions that get passed down in ways the occupiers can't detect or prevent." Sarah was working with the colony's teachers, religious leaders, and storytellers to create hidden curricula that would keep human values alive even under hegemony rule. Children's games that taught resistance tactics, work songs that contained coded information, holiday traditions that could serve as cover for resistance meetings. Marcus's own role was perhaps the most crucial: communication networks. He was installing quantum entanglement transmitters in hidden locations throughout the colony, disguised as routine infrastructure upgrades. When complete, the network would allow instantaneous, undetectable communication with other seed pod operations and Federation intelligence. "The beauty of quantum entanglement," explained Lieutenant Torres during one of her visits to the colony, "is that the hegemony can't intercept or decode the transmissions. They can't even detect that communication is happening. What about the hardware? Won't they find the transmitters? Not if we hide them properly. The actual quantum processors are smaller than your thumb. We're embedding them in everything from water purification systems to mining equipment. Even if the hegemony finds one or two, they'll assume it's just advanced Federation technology they don't understand yet." 6 months into the operation, Marcus received word that changed everything. The hegemony was accelerating their advance. Intelligence suggested they would reach Kepler 619c within 3 months, not the 18 months originally projected. "We're not ready," Dr. Kim said during an emergency meeting in the deepest part of the mine complex. "Half the medical training is incomplete, and we haven't finished stockpiling supplies. The weapon caches are only 30% complete," Patterson added. "And we haven't identified all the potential resistance leaders yet." Marcus looked around at his team. 6 months ago, they'd been strangers thrown together by circumstance. Now they were the core of what might be humanity's most important long-term strategic operation. "We work with what we have," he said finally. "The hegemony expects to find a mining colony. Let's make sure that's exactly what they find, right up until they realize they've swallowed a poison pill." The next 3 months were a blur of frantic preparation. Training sessions became more intensive. Supply caches were hidden in the deepest mine shafts. Communication networks were tested and retested. Most importantly, the colonists themselves were gradually brought into the resistance network. To Marcus's surprise, the hardest part wasn't convincing people to fight. It was convincing them to wait. "You want us to just surrender when they arrive?" demanded Rebecca Walsh, a mining supervisor whose family had been on the frontier for 3 generations. "Let them walk in and take over without firing a shot." "I want you to survive," Marcus replied. "The hegemony expects heroic last stands. They know how to deal with that kind of resistance. What they don't expect is a colony that bides its time, learns their weaknesses, and strikes when they're not looking. That's not the human way." Marcus thought about his grandmother's gardens, about the patient work of preparing soil and tending crops through seasons of drought and plenty. Maybe it's time we discovered a new human way. When the hegemony fleet finally appeared in Kepler 619c's system, Marcus was in the colony's main communications center, officially monitoring mining operations and unofficially coordinating the final preparations for what everyone hoped would be a very long, very quiet war. The first hegemony ships to enter orbit were sleek, angular vessels that moved with predatory grace. Behind them came the larger ships, troop transports, administrative vessels, the massive industrial processors that would begin reshaping the colony according to hegemony standards. "All stations, this is Admiral Kektar of the Hegemony 4th Fleet," came the transmission that everyone had been dreading. "You will prepare for immediate occupation. Any resistance will be met with overwhelming force." Maria Santos, still playing her role as colonial administrator, responded with appropriate resignation. "Understood, Admiral. We're prepared to cooperate fully." As Marcus watched the hegemony ships settle into occupation positions, he thought about seeds planted in frozen ground, waiting for spring. The real war was about to begin, and it would be fought not with ships and guns but with patience, persistence, and the quiet hope that even the darkest winter eventually comes to an end. The occupation of Kepler 619c began 3 hours later. By the end of the first day, the hegemony believed they had conquered another mining colony with minimal resistance. They had no idea what they'd actually walked into. The hegemony occupation of Kepler 619c proceeded exactly as Marcus had hoped it would, efficiently, predictably, and with complete confidence in their own superiority. Within 2 weeks, they had established their administrative center in the colony's main government building, reorganized the mining operations according to their standards, and begun the process of cultural optimization. To any outside observer, it looked like a textbook hegemony conquest. Marcus, now working as a communications technician under hegemony supervision, watched their new overlords with the careful attention his grandmother had taught him to pay to weather patterns. The hegemony commanders were competent but arrogant. The rank-and-file soldiers were disciplined but homesick. And the civilian administrators were focused on meeting production quotas rather than watching for signs of resistance. More importantly, they were following the same patterns that had worked for them on dozens of other conquered worlds, which meant that every aspect of their occupation could be predicted, analyzed, and eventually exploited. "Status report," Admiral Kektar demanded during the weekly administrative meeting that Marcus attended in his cover role as Senior Communications Coordinator. "Mining operations are at 95% of preoccupation levels," reported Commander Vexhai, the hegemony officer now in charge of industrial operations. "Labor compliance is excellent. No signs of organized resistance. Cultural optimization, proceeding on schedule. The human educational systems have been restructured. Religious and cultural activities are being monitored and gradually modified. We expect full compliance within 18 months. Marcus kept his expression neutral while mentally cataloging everything he heard. Each piece of information was immediately transmitted via quantum entanglement to Federation intelligence, building a detailed picture of hegemony, occupation procedures that would be invaluable for other seed pod operations. But the real resistance work happened in the spaces between official activities. Dr. Kim had successfully treated 3 cases of industrial accidents that were actually injuries sustained during weapons training. The injuries were real enough to fool hegemony medical inspections, but the treatments included coded instructions for resistance cell activities. Patterson had managed to divert nearly 30% of the colony's industrial explosives into hidden caches, disguised as routine waste disposal. The hegemony's own efficiency protocols worked against them. They were so focused on optimizing production that they rarely questioned where the waste materials actually went. Sarah Okafor had woven resistance communication protocols into the colony's traditional work songs. Miners sang while they worked, just as they always had. But now the songs carried coded messages about patrol schedules, supply locations, and potential targets. Most importantly, the quantum communication network was working perfectly. Every night, Marcus uploaded detailed intelligence reports that were instantly transmitted to Federation Command. Information about hegemony ship movements, troop rotations, supply chains, and administrative procedures flowed back to human space, where it was analyzed and distributed to other resistance operations. The hegemony had no idea they were being studied like laboratory specimens. 3 months into the occupation, Marcus received a priority message that made his blood run cold. The hegemony was planning to relocate a significant portion of Kepler 619c's population to industrial worlds deeper in their territory. It was a standard procedure designed to break up community ties and make resistance more difficult. "We have to stop this," Sarah said during an emergency meeting in an abandoned mining shaft 3 kilometers below the surface. "How?" Dr. Kim asked. "If we act openly, we blow the entire operation." Marcus had been thinking about this problem for weeks. "We don't stop them. We make them stop themselves." He pulled up a holographic display showing the colony's industrial output statistics. The hegemony values efficiency above everything else. Right now, this colony is producing at 95% of preoccupation levels with the existing workforce. What happens if that productivity drops? Patterson caught on immediately. They'll investigate, try to identify the problem. And what if the problem is that relocating experienced miners reduces productivity more than they expected? Sarah frowned. "You want to sabotage our own operations? I want to make the math work in our favor. Show them that keeping the population here is more profitable than relocating them." Over the next 2 weeks, the seed pod team implemented what Marcus privately called malicious compliance. Nothing that could be traced as sabotage, just a series of small inefficiencies that added up to a noticeable drop in productivity. Equipment broke down more frequently due to maintenance errors. Communication systems experienced intermittent failures that slowed coordination. Workers developed a puzzling tendency to misunderstand orders, requiring time-consuming clarification. The hegemony response was exactly what Marcus had predicted. They brought in efficiency experts, conducted detailed analyses, and eventually reached the conclusion that the proposed population relocation would be counterproductive. The human workers have specialized knowledge of local conditions, Commander Vexhai reported to Admiral Kektar. Replacing them with relocated populations would require extensive retraining and result in a significant temporary productivity loss. Recommendation? Maintain the current workforce. Implement enhanced monitoring to prevent future productivity issues. Marcus smiled as he filed the official report. Enhanced monitoring meant more hegemony personnel tied down in administrative roles, more resources devoted to watching a population that appeared completely pacified, and more opportunities for the resistance to study their occupiers' methods. But the real victory came 6 months later, when Marcus received a coded transmission from Federation intelligence. The seed pod operations were working beyond their most optimistic projections. Resistance cells on 43 worlds were providing continuous intelligence about hegemony operations. The information was being used to plan strategic operations that were slowly bleeding the hegemony war machine. More importantly, the cultural preservation efforts were succeeding. Children on occupied worlds were growing up with hidden knowledge of their true heritage, passed down through songs, games, and stories that the hegemony couldn't detect. The idea of freedom was being kept alive in the hearts and minds of an entire generation. "The hegemony is beginning to realize they have a problem," reported Admiral Reyes during one of Marcus's rare direct communications with Federation Command. "Their occupation costs are running higher than projected. Their industrial output from conquered worlds is lower than expected, and they're starting to suspect that human populations are more difficult to control than they initially calculated. Are they adapting their procedures?" They're trying to, but adaptation requires understanding the problem, and they still don't realize that their conquered worlds are riddled with active resistance networks. They think they're dealing with cultural incompatibility, not organized opposition. Marcus felt a surge of pride in what they'd accomplished. The hegemony had conquered 47 worlds and thought they'd won 47 victories. They had no idea that they'd actually swallowed 47 poison pills that were slowly working their way through the body of their empire. "What's our next phase?" "Patience," Admiral Reyes replied. "Keep gathering intelligence, keep preserving human culture. Keep making the occupation as expensive as possible. The hegemony's expansion is already slowing, due to the increased administrative burden of managing conquered populations. In 5 years, maybe 10, they'll have to choose between continued expansion and maintaining control of what they've already taken. And when they make that choice, that's when the seeds you've planted will bloom into something the hegemony never expected to see on conquered worlds. Hope." As Marcus signed off the communication, he thought about his grandmother's garden again. She'd always said that the most important part of farming wasn't the planting or even the harvesting. It was the waiting, the patient tending, the faith that seeds planted in good soil would eventually grow into something beautiful. The hegemony controlled the surface of 47 worlds, but beneath that surface, in the hidden places where resistance took root and grew, humanity was preparing for a harvest they couldn't even imagine. Marcus Chen, the failed cadet from a small farming colony, had learned to plant seeds in the darkness between stars. Now all he had to do was wait for them to grow. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the hegemony expansion began, Marcus believed that humanity might actually win it. 7 years after the occupation of Kepler 619c, Marcus received the message he'd been waiting for his entire adult life. It came through the quantum entanglement network in the early hours of a mining shift, encoded in what appeared to be routine maintenance schedules for the ore processing equipment. "Spring planting begins at dawn." He stared at the words for a long moment, hardly believing what he was reading. Then he quietly began implementing protocols that had been dormant for years, sending coded signals through networks that the hegemony had never suspected existed. Across 47 worlds, other resistance leaders were receiving the same message and beginning the same careful preparations. The harvest was about to begin. The plan that unfolded over the following weeks was nothing like the massive fleet engagements that had characterized the early years of the war. Instead, it was subtle, coordinated, and utterly devastating in ways the hegemony couldn't understand until it was too late. On Kepler 619c, Marcus's first target wasn't a military installation or government building. It was the colony's central communication hub, the nexus through which all hegemony administrative traffic flowed. 7 years of patient observation had taught him exactly when the facility would be most vulnerable. The attack came during the weekly system maintenance cycle, when most of the equipment was offline for routine diagnostics. Marcus and his team slipped into the facility using access codes they'd been cultivating for years. And within 20 minutes, they'd installed modifications that would give them complete control over the hegemony's communication networks. To any outside observer, the maintenance cycle proceeded normally, but when the systems came back online, every hegemony transmission was being monitored, analyzed, and selectively modified by the resistance. Across the galaxy, similar operations were taking place simultaneously. Communication networks were compromised. Supply chain databases were subtly altered. Administrative systems began reporting false information about production quotas, troop movements, and resource allocations. The beauty of the plan was that none of it looked like sabotage. The hegemony's own bureaucratic complexity worked against them. When production reports didn't match actual shipments, administrators assumed it was a clerical error. When troop rotation schedules got confused, commanders blamed inefficient logistics. When supply convoys arrived at the wrong destinations, everyone assumed someone else had made a mistake. Meanwhile, the resistance networks that had been dormant for years suddenly came alive with coordinated activity. Weapons caches were distributed. Safe houses were activated. Communication protocols that had been disguised as children's games and work songs revealed their true purpose. Status report from all sectors. Marcus requested during a resistance meeting in the deepest tunnels of the mine complex. For the first time in 7 years, they were meeting in full daylight, with lookouts posted and escape routes prepared. Dr. Kim spoke first. Medical facilities are ready. We've identified and treated resistance fighters, and we have field hospitals prepared in 12 hidden locations. More importantly, we've been documenting hegemony medical procedures and biological weaknesses for years. Their soldiers are vulnerable to several local pathogens they haven't developed immunity to. Patterson grinned as he delivered his report. 7 years of industrial accidents have given us enough explosives to level every major hegemony installation on the planet. Plus, we've identified structural weaknesses in their administrative buildings, communication towers, and military facilities. They built everything according to standard templates, which means once you know how to bring down one hegemony building, you know how to bring them all down. Sarah's cultural preservation work had evolved into something far more powerful than anyone had expected. The children who were 8 years old when the occupation began are 15 now. They've grown up speaking hegemony languages and following hegemony customs, but they've also absorbed human values through stories, songs, and traditions the occupiers never suspected. When the time comes, we'll have an entire generation that can move freely in hegemony society while working for human freedom. But it was the quantum communication network that provided the most crucial capability. Marcus could coordinate with resistance cells across the galaxy in real time, sharing intelligence, tactical information, and strategic updates instantaneously. Resistance command to all seed pod operations, came Admiral Reyes's voice through the quantum link. Phase 2 is a go. Begin systematic disruption of hegemony supply chains. What followed was a masterpiece of coordinated subtlety. Across 47 worlds, resistance cells began implementing small changes that cascaded into massive systemic failures. Shipping manifests were altered so that critical supplies ended up in the wrong systems. Manufacturing specifications were modified so that equipment components wouldn't fit together properly. Administrative databases were corrupted in ways that made it impossible to track resource allocations accurately. The hegemony's response was exactly what Marcus had hoped for. They increased security measures, brought in more administrators, and devoted increasing resources to managing their conquered territories. Every ship assigned to occupation duty was a ship that couldn't be used for expansion. Every soldier standing guard over a mining colony was a soldier who couldn't fight on the front lines. Sir, Marcus heard Commander Vexhai report to Admiral Kektar during one of their administrative meetings. We're experiencing significant inefficiencies across multiple occupied systems. Production is down, administrative costs are up, and we're having difficulty maintaining proper oversight of civilian populations. Cause? Unknown. Possibly cultural incompatibility with human work methods. Possibly inadequate initial planning for long-term occupation. The efficiency experts are recommending a comprehensive review of our occupation procedures. Marcus had to suppress a smile. The hegemony was doing exactly what bureaucracies always did when faced with problems they didn't understand. They were forming committees to study the situation. Meanwhile, the real war was being fought in shadows and whispers, in communication networks they couldn't monitor, and through cultural channels they couldn't comprehend. 7 years of patient preparation were finally bearing fruit. The breakthrough came when Marcus received intelligence that changed everything. The hegemony's expansion had effectively stopped. They were pouring so many resources into managing their existing conquests that they couldn't afford to launch new invasions. More importantly, several hegemony military units had been withdrawn from frontline duties to help maintain order on occupied worlds. The Federation fleet is advancing on 3 fronts, Admiral Reyes reported through the quantum link. For the first time since the war began, we have numerical superiority in active combat zones. The hegemony is scrambling to redeploy forces, but they're afraid to reduce occupation forces because they're starting to suspect organized resistance. What are our orders? Maintain current operations. Keep bleeding their resources. Make them choose between holding what they have and defending against our advance. But Marcus had a different idea. Admiral, what if we gave them a third option? Explain. What if we made it clear that they can't hold what they have? Not through open rebellion, but through systematic proof that human populations will never be truly pacified? Marcus outlined his plan during an emergency meeting of resistance leaders across all 47 worlds. It was ambitious, coordinated, and completely dependent on the cultural networks that Sarah and her counterparts had been building for 7 years. On a predetermined day, at exactly the same time across the galaxy, Something unprecedented happened on every hegemony-occupied world. Work songs changed, children's games shifted, holiday celebrations took on new meanings. Cultural practices that had seemed harmless for years suddenly revealed their true nature as vehicles for coordinated resistance. The hegemony administrators woke up to find that their carefully controlled populations were singing songs they didn't recognize, playing games with hidden meanings, and celebrating holidays that honored human heroes the occupiers had thought were forgotten. It wasn't violence. It wasn't terrorism. It was something far more frightening to a regime based on cultural domination. It was proof that human identity had survived 7 years of systematic oppression and was now reasserting itself openly. "Sir," Commander Vexhai reported to Admiral Kektar, his voice showing strain for the first time since the occupation began. "We have a problem. The human populations are exhibiting coordinated cultural behaviors across multiple star systems. It appears they've maintained hidden communication networks throughout the occupation period." Marcus watched Admiral Kektar's reaction carefully. The hegemony commander was realizing that his perfect occupation was nothing of the sort. That every day for 7 years he'd been outsmarted by the people he thought he controlled. "How is this possible?" the Admiral demanded. "We're still investigating, but it appears that human cultural practices are more complex and resilient than our initial assessments indicated." That night, Marcus received a priority transmission from Federation Command that made everything worthwhile. Hegemony Central Command has issued orders for strategic withdrawal from 15 occupied systems. A.